morning, everyone. Welcome to 2021 and welcome to the Institute for Work and Health Speaker Series. Today we have Lynda Robson, who'll be presenting on some work she's recently done to examine the union safety effect in the construction sector. Let me tell you a little bit about Lynda before we start. In fact, let me introduce myself before we start. My name is Peter Smith. I'm one of the scientific staff here at the Institute for Work and Health. So Lynda Robson has been a scientist at the Institute for Work and Health, where she's worked since 1997. She also holds adjunct professor appointments at the School of Occupation and Public Health at Ryerson University. Lynda will be presenting, as I said today, around the union effect on safety in the construction industry. If you do have questions or comments, please put them into the chat box. You can do that throughout the presentation, and we will read them to Lynda at the end of the presentation, and she will answer them at that particular time. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Lynda, for your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Peter, and good morning, everyone. Before I get started, I would like to draw your attention to the research team and the co-PI of this project. They are a talented and committed group of individuals, and each played an important role in the project. My presentation will last 25 to 30 minutes, so it'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. Our objective in this study was to determine the effect of unionization on an organization's injury incidence within the ICI construction sector for the period of time 2012 to 2018. So this represents an update of an earlier IWH study, which used data from 2006 to 2012. The results of that project have since been published in the peer-reviewed literature. Both of these projects were supported by the Ontario Construction Secretariat. This is a joint labor management organization representing the collective interests of the unionized ICI construction sector in Ontario. And one of the things it does is provide value-added research to its membership. So that's where we come in for this particular project. I'm first going to lay out some of the broader research context surrounding this particular project. So the first thing, from various lines of evidence, from what we understand about unions' roles, and from various case study, anecdotal information, one-shot cross-sectional surveys, we have an understanding that unions promote safer work conditions for workers. And they do that through various means: provisions and collective agreements, ensuring regulatory compliance by organizations, enhancing enforcement, providing information and training to workers, participating in joint health and safety committees, advocating for better control of hazards and risks, and empowering workers to exercise their rights. And so it's been a bit of a conundrum when quantitative studies have been undertaken to examine the relationship between unionization and injuries. In a review by Donato of 25 studies published up to 2009, the expected relationship with fatal injuries was found. That is, a lower risk of injuries was found in unionized organizations. But when it came to non-fatal injuries, which was the subject of the majority of these studies, the vast majority of those studies showed a higher risk of non-fatal injuries in unionized workplaces. So this was unexpected. The authors across these studies spent a lot of time discussing why this might be. And the most common explanation was that there was differential reporting. So unionized workplaces were posited, and there's some evidence for unionized workers being more likely to report injuries, and unionized workplaces being more likely to report injuries to authorities. And there's some evidence that was provided by Marantz in 2013, which was consistent with this hypothesis and also shows us how this plays out with different types of injuries. And in fact, her study represented an advance in the literature by considering different subcategories of injuries. So I'm just going to spend a bit of time explaining this particular study because I think it provides a backdrop for understanding the results in our studies in the ICI sector. So when Marantz looked at the relationship between unionization and total non-fatal injuries, she found, like the Donato review found, that there was a higher risk of injury in unionized workplaces, 10% higher. But when she divided this group of total injuries into two subcategories, a group of more severe injuries on the one hand, and then less severe injuries on the other hand, quite different findings arose. That is, with the more severe injuries, an apparent union safety effect was found. Whereas with other non-fatal injuries, where there's more discretion about reporting, the relationship of or the higher risk in unionized companies was found. These were coal mines, in fact. And this picture is extended even further if we include fatal injuries. So it seems like when the injury type is less susceptible to reporting bias, we are more likely to be able to detect and measure the union safety effect that's expected from other lines of evidence, as that earlier slide discussed. The last point I'd like to make about the research context is that there has been few studies conducted solely within construction. The review by Donato did not include one focused on construction. And so we go to 2010, Zullo looked at construction, focused on the construction industry in US states, and found for this time period of the knots, union density was associated with a lower fatal injury rate. So the expected relationship. Then with Amick et al., the first IWH study that we are now updating, there was a pattern that I think should remind you of what was seen in the Marantz study. And that is with no lost time injury claims. So these are injuries where it has not required any time away from work. There's been medical aid provided, but no lost time from work. So they tend to be more minor. And in this case, unionization was associated with a higher claim rate. When it came to lost time injuries, generally more serious, less frequent, then unionization was associated with a lower injury claim rate. So the Amick et al. Study was a contribution by contributing to more information about the construction sector in particular. We all know that the construction sector is quite different than other industrial settings. And it contributed by looking at different categories of non-fatal injuries. So let me tell you about how our study was conducted, and the methods are very similar to that of the first study by Amick et al. The first thing we needed to do was identify the companies within the WSIB employer records which represented the ICI construction sector. OCS assisted in that, identifying classification units, which you can see are like industrial subsectors where the ICI trades can be found. So there's 39 of them, and we included in our initial sample any company in which the largest portion of its payroll was found in in a line of business that fit into one of these 39 categories. So from here on in, I think I will be referring to these classification units as CUs. And you can just think industrial subsector. And I'd like to point out the diversity of company structures you might end up with. And there's a reason for doing this. We'll come back to it later. But just to say, within our initial sample, most companies were the simple case. They had one line of business that fell into one of those 39 CUs. Other companies were more complex. They had more than one line of business, so they were mapped to 2 different CUs or more. And the final case is where there might actually be a mix, whereas the major portion of the payroll could have fallen into ICI. They might have had other lines of business falling outside of those 39 CUs I described. So moving on to a major step in the study, having identified the companies with their largest payroll in an ICI CU, 108,000 of them. We extracted several, we created several variables. The WSIB records are quite rich in this. We could learn for a given company how many CUs it had, and for each of those CUs, how many full-time equivalent employees were associated with it, and how many injury claims, and also descriptors of the type of injuries. What we didn't have here is whether a company was unionized or not. And so that's where the collaboration with OCS was critical to being able to carry out this study. They were able to facilitate the provision of 24 different lists from unions and employer associations, lists of contractors that employed unionized workers. So that allowed us to create a variable in our WSIB data set, which indicated whether a company was unionized or not. So we matched records using company name, postal code, phone number. Those abbreviations should be switched. And for any match we found, we would then classify a WSIB record as unionized. We required for our main analysis that 2 out of 3 of these variables matched. However, for a sensitivity analysis, we loosened our definition and required only a match on name. When we, after doing the matching, we undertook a little supplemental analysis of the union contractor records that remained unmatched, did a manual search of WSIB records using additional information from address, and to the extent that we could, and from that, estimate that the matching success was 94%, in the sense that if that record was there, there was a 94% chance we had matched it by the time we reached the end of this sensitivity analysis matching. And for this, we used manual methods, computer-assisted methods, including machine learning. So we have our initial sample of 108,000 companies, we've been able to identify which of them were unionized, or at least one of the CUs were unionized. We next disaggregated them into their constituent CUs, if you will, and then excluded anything that didn't fall into one of those ICI 39 ICI CU categories, as well as any companies whose FTE was too small. So this is cumulative FTE. There was a requirement for at least one FTE cumulative over the 7-year period to be included. So this was the same criterion as was used before. And at the end of this process, we had 60,000 company CUs comprising our analytical sample. 9% of the company CUs were unionized. However, if you look at full-time equivalents involved in those company CUs, we see that 45% of the workforce was unionized in our sample, which again is a number that reassures us that our matching was successful. I show here too the total number of lost time allowed claims and no lost time allowed claims involved in the study. One thing to note is that there's more no lost time claims than lost time claims. And another thing to note is the difference in the ratio in the two groups. Okay, the final thing I want to tell you about the methods is that we use negative binomial regression modeling of the relationship between unionization and injury claim rate. And we controlled for factors that could otherwise interfere with us trying to estimate the effect of unionization on its own. And this was enabled by the data within the WSIB data set. So that included company size, complexity in terms of the number of CUs in a company, the type of construction activity, since they have different risks, and geographical location, in case there were differences in enforcement, say, between where unionized companies are found and non-unionized. Now, as far as company size and complexity, the reason for including these two variables is that larger and more sophisticated companies are expected to devote more resources and have more expert resources devoted to health and safety. And so it wouldn't really be fair to compare one group versus another if one group had much more frequent larger companies. And you can see that this was an issue for our particular sample, and indeed firm size was the most important covariate. You can see with the unionized group, about in blue bars, about a third of the company CUs came from companies with 20 or more employees, whereas that same figure for the non-unionized is only 3% if we add those two groups. Okay, so what did we find at the end of all this? I first want to orient you to the way we're going to present the results. We're using the adjusted risk ratio. The adjusted means we've taken into account those 4 factors we discussed. So their role should be minimized. So we get this so-called apples to apples comparison as best we can do. And the risk ratio we're looking at is the risk of an injury claim in a unionized organization divided by the risk in a non-unionized organization. So that means Any values over 1 are indicating that there's a higher risk in unionized companies, and values below 1 are indicating a lower risk. So what did we find? For lost time injury claims, we see a lower risk in the unionized company CUs, a 25% lower risk. So we would sometimes call this the union safety effect. Whereas when it came to no lost time claims, we found no difference between unionized and non-unionized. How does this compare with the Amick et al. Study? In both cases, our values are lower than what was seen before, suggesting a larger union safety effect. However, it must be noted that the populations of companies are different in these two. Not only is the time period different, but as of 2013, there was a push for registration, a requirement for solo operators to be registered in the WSIB database. And this seemed to spill over into other firm sizes as well. So just to note, there's been a change in the population. But both of these studies are indicating, suggesting a union safety effect. So both values are below 1. And we differ then in that we didn't see a difference between unionized and non-unionized, but in the Amick et al. Study, they found an increased risk of no lost time injury in unionized companies. Our plentiful sample size allowed us to undertake some subgroup analyses. And the first we're going to look at is company size. So we took our sample, divided into 4 groups depending on the average number of annual FTEs, basically the number of employees in the company. And you can see that there's a range of values here. The two, I should have said, so 4 separate regression analyses were carried out. For the 2 intermediate size categories, you can see the results are quite similar to what was found for the group as a whole. That was 0.75. Whereas for this largest group with 50 or more employees, we see an even lower ratio, equivalent to a 44% lower risk of a lost time claim. And on the other hand, for companies with less than 5 employees, we see no union safety effect. Why might this be? It could be that, and our data cannot speak to this, I'm just offering potential interpretations. Why might this be? We know that the smaller organizations are regulated quite differently. There's no requirement for a health and safety representative. People can work on a site without a supervisor when there's less than 5 people, and there's no requirement for posting of health and safety information. So, and in general, these very smalls are a challenge for public authorities to reach. So perhaps those chronic challenges override to a certain extent any union safety effect. The other subgroup analysis we undertook was with regards to CU type. And you can see 7 of the 39 CU categories were analyzed separately. We present only 7 because we, as you go into the individual CUs, numbers can get quite small. we required that a sufficiently narrow confidence interval of 0.5 or less be the requirement for reporting. You can see that all of these are below 1, and there's a fair amount of variation in their values. The last portion of results I want to share with you are the results of the sensitivity tests that we did. In the first row is our base case, our main findings. In our first sensitivity test, we loosened the union definition as I described before. In our second test, we restricted the analysis to companies with only a single CU. We did this because you'll recall our matching took place at the level of the company, but our analysis is at the level of company CU. So perhaps that assumption of, one CU unionized means the whole company or all CUs are unionized was wrong. So in case of misclassification, then let's just focus on single CUs. And finally, when we looked at the description of the different ICI CU categories, it seemed that some of them could include companies that weren't even working in ICI. They might be working in home building and be included in the non-unionized group because they didn't appear in our list of ICI unionized companies. So we restricted that analysis to 7 CUs that seem to sit most certainly within ICI. So you'll see with these different tests, we hardly budged the adjusted risk ratio, and all remain statistically significant. So I'll just move into 3 closing slides, and I'll start with the limitations. So as any research project should do, we should point out where our study is limited. All studies have limitations. So we've reported results regarding the lost time injuries that suggest a union safety effect. And from our earlier discussion, we would think that this had to do with safer working conditions. But we can't be certain that that is the case because we did not measure the working conditions in these workplaces. We can say it's likely not an artifact related to company size, complexity, CU profile, and geography because we controlled for those variables statistically. There are, though, other unmeasured variables which could influence our estimate of the union effect. Job tenure, in particular, we know that workers have longer tenure within unionized companies, and this in itself would contribute to a safety effect because we know short tenure is associated with a greater chance of being injured. And then finally, our FTEs are imputed from employer payroll using an average wage for that subsector. And so to the extent that wage rates differ between unionized and non-unionized companies, there is an artifact created that contributes to the apparent union effect. When we've investigated in depth as to this artifact, it does not seem to explain fully the union effect, nor does it follow the pattern that we saw with firm size. And of course, our study is limited to the ICI construction sector and doesn't speak to other types of construction. On the other hand, the study has some strengths. Its large sample size, the comprehensive set of lists and union contractors we had, to develop the unionization variable, a high rate of matching, statistical control for some important variables that were not always controlled for in some of those studies reviewed by Donato, like company size, like the type of work. We had with CU, we have a very fine measure of the type of work. We found there was a robustness to sensitivity testing, and moreover, there's a robustness of the lost time claim findings across the two studies, so two different research teams and two different time periods. And we also know we are making a contribution to this gap in the literature regarding construction. So to conclude, unionization was associated with a lower workers' compensation lost time injury claim incidence in ICI construction in Ontario. We have a high degree of confidence in this association within our data. It was robust to the sensitivity tests. We found variation in this association, however, by company size and by industrial subsector. And in particular, this association was not found in companies with less than 5 employees. And in our study, unionization was not associated with no lost time claim incidents. So I'd like to acknowledge additional individuals from IWH, present and former, that contributed in some way to this project, as well OCS, unions, and employer associations that shared their lists of unionized contractors, and to the province of Ontario that provides core funding to the Institute. Here is my contact information. So if you have any questions in the following days, don't hesitate to be in touch. I can provide the final report. You can also find it here on our website. And we will be moving the results of this study, the final, what's contained in the final report, to peer-reviewed publication. And so I can alert you to when that is available. And here are other links to continue your relationship with IWH with. So I thank you for your attention and welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Lynda. We already have a number of questions in the chat box, which I will start to read. Just a reminder to the audience, if you do have questions for Lynda, please do enter them into the chat box and I will read them out for you. The first, there's a series of questions, Lynda, that deal, I think, with some of the classification issues. So one of them is around when a firm is designated to be unionized.
Start again, Peter. Sorry, just that sentence. Start again.
When a firm is designated as a unionized firm, does that mean every person in the firm is unionized, or could it be a mixture of unionized and non-unionized workers?
Yes, it could be a mixture.
Okay. And in terms of when a non-union company would subcontract a unionized company, how would that be handled in terms of the data?
We would, I'm assuming the non-unionized company would have its own individual employer account within WSIB. That should be the case. And so we would be dealing with them separately.
Okay. The next, there's another one here just around the classification. So Ontario has 3 integrated steel companies. Should they have been captured in their own ICI grouping? And if not, which one of the ICI groupings would the integrated steel companies have been in?
Yeah, this, without fully knowing what an integrated steel company means, I do think that they would be in integrated school. Either, what is it, primary, sorry. So I think in manufacturing or another category, I don't think they would be within construction.
Okay. And finally, just around some of the classification issues. So projects with 50 or more employees, which last for 3 months or more, are required to have a worker trade committee, which is a formal avenue to raise and have occupational health and safety concerns addressed. Were you able to identify firms that fit into that category in terms of the data?
No, this study is really looking at the level of the employer, and even, you know, as you saw, at a lower level, the company CU, if you will. But we, the type of thing being described there would have required more of a project approach. So I can't speak to that, no.
Okay. So earlier in the presentation, Lynda, you had described how groups had a higher risk of fatal injury. This was in some of the previous research that you had described. Are you able to tell a little bit more about how that was defined? Was it an acute fatal injury? Was it, I guess, how was it defined in terms of the research?
Yeah, so I think with, as opposed to, I don't think it included occupational exposures. So it would have been a acute, yeah, so I believe it's just an acute onset type of fatal fatality.
Okay. How does the analysis, or does the analysis account for any chronic health effects? I think you've sort of answered this around that it's mainly ecological, but there's a question that, you know, when this person worked in construction, the literature sort of said that construction workers were deaf at 55 and dead at 65. I guess, is there a way to deal with that, or how do you think that might impact the findings?
Yeah, that's almost a different type of question related to occupational diseases, which wasn't involved in the data that we were using.
Okay, so now I'm going to group a series of questions here which were around the differences between no lost time claims and lost time claims. I'm going to, I guess, give them to you all together because they're kind of all related. One was just about, could you tell us a little bit more about why you think there's a difference? And then two of the questions have sort of suggested a hypothesis. So one was that maybe unionised workers are more likely to report a no lost time claim than a non-unionised worker. And the second is that, which they've described as the bloody hand in pocket syndrome, where for non-unionised firms, because of job insecurity, they might be less likely to report an injury if it occurs in the workplace. And I guess maybe to the extent to which you could generally comment on what are, you know, to what extent reporting differences among unionised versus non-unionised firms might be at play here.
Yeah, so I do think there would be a difference. The type of pattern that was implied by the Donato review, and also with the Marantz study in coal mines, I think there's good reason to believe that that type of differential reporting bias arising from differences in inclination, if you will, or ability, if you will, to report an injury in unionized versus non-unionized exists in Ontario. So we do know from data in Quebec and data in Alberta. So different types of studies that were quite different than this design, where they were surveying workers about whether they'd had an injury and did they register a workers' compensation claim. And these were, again, multivariable regression type of analyses where they were controlling for other factors. And so all things being equal, it did seem that unionization was associated with a greater inclination to report an injury. And so we do think that part of what we're seeing with no lost time here is almost a competition between this differential reporting bias and a union safety effect. And so we think the balance is shifted when you get to more serious injuries. It's less discretionary of whether you report them. So it's almost like the union safety effect can then outweigh, if you will, the is less masked by the differential reporting bias.
Great. Lynda, do you think it would be possible to examine if the risks are similar or different for injuries to men versus injuries to women in terms of construction firms and unionized versus non-unionized firms?
Yeah, that would be very interesting, but unfortunately we had no workforce data, and within the workers' compensation data, we only have information on injured workers, which we suggested if this study was to be carried out again in the future, it might be worth developing variables from that information, but it was not something that we did at the outset and therefore have not looked at it.
Okay. A question here about the CORE program, and if you were able to consider whether companies were currently participating in CORE and how that might impact your results, the certificate of recognition program.
Right. So there's a certificate of recognition program that I believe IHSA administers. That's been going on for several years. So that is not a variable that's available in the WSIB database. I was recently contacted by IHSA so we haven't done it, but it seems as though there might be an opportunity to do that in collaboration with IHSA, since they track employer account numbers as part of the CORE program. So in that way, we'd be able to separate the union effect and the effect of CORE, see if it makes any difference to our estimate of the union effect. But it did make me wonder whether it's contributing to this lower risk ratio in the largest companies. But that's just speculation, right?
At this stage, yes. Okay. There's an invitation if there are opportunities to collaborate with you and your research team. I assume that would be okay. Did you want to put up your contact information, Lynda, just in case people wanted to get in contact with you about different bits and pieces? There it is, lrobson@iwh.on.ca. So this is just a follow-up to the question I had asked before, obviously not well enough around the risk of fatal injuries. So the question is, what audit tool would be utilized to determine higher risk of fatal injury?
Which audit tool? Sorry.
That's the question is, I'm assuming it was just actual fatal injuries over the number of people working, but.
Yeah, so we didn't look at fatal injuries. Fortunately, they would be too few for us to be able to carry out the type of analyses that we did. So it was Marantz with coal mines in the US that was able to look at fatal injuries. So yeah, so I don't think I have too much to say with regards to fatal injuries, if that's all right.
No, that's fine. There's a question, I think you've already answered a question around, I guess, around gender and the opportunity to maybe examine that a little bit further. Do you see any benefit in doing further research to look at a union safety effect around occupational disease related to unionised versus non-unionised firms?
Yes.
And would you restrict that to construction, or do you think that would be worth expanding to other sectors?
Yeah, with the type of design we have here, it would be restricted to construction, because the critical piece of information about unionization is missing from the WSIB database. So it would require comprehensive lists of unionized companies. But theoretically, it could be expanded beyond construction.
Yeah, and I imagine it would also be complicated a little bit by if people have worked in both unionised and non-unionised firms and understanding the relative contribution. But it's certainly a very interesting question. So I think that is, at the moment, that is all the questions we seem to have in the chat box. As I said, if people do have other questions, please type them in at the moment. I'll provide another little bit of information. Oh, hang on, I spoke too soon. So there is another question in the chat box, which is, are there specific studies on the role of training, both apprenticeship training and general occupational health and safety training, and if that influences the reporting of lost time injuries?
That's a good question. I can't bring a particular study to mind. In theory, that should be the case, right? Because we learn through health and safety training that one should report injuries and symptoms and hazards.
We have another comment in the chat, in the question box, which says that there are such studies from CPWR in the US that have looked at the effect of training on injury reporting. So I guess if people want to look at that a bit more, that would be great.
Right. For Canadians that are not familiar with the CPWR website, which is US based, but nevertheless rich in information, that some of which can be, I think, applicable to Canada.
So there's another question which has just come in. Was there any consideration for including no lost time claims in the study or separately? I believe you might want to go, I think that they were presented separately, the no lost time claims. My experience is that unionised employers are more used to providing suitable accommodations than non-unionised employers. And maybe is that another explanation for the differing rates or differing effects you've seen for lost time versus no lost time injuries?
I've wondered whether it could be contributing to the union effect in lost time with respect to lost time injuries, if that indeed is the case. So potentially, yes.
Okay, I'm just actually putting something in the chat box, which was actually another paper on the reporting thing. So for people who want to see that in the chat box, there's an article in JOEM from 2004 on the effects of safety and health training on work-related injury among construction labourers.
Great.
Okay. If there are any other questions, we do have another 5 minutes or so for today's presentation. If people have any more additional questions they would like to ask Lynda at this particular point.
Peter, Perhaps, do we have a record of the chat? I'm particularly interested in the person who offered that potential hypothesis about different inclinations of offering accommodation, unionized versus non-unionized, because yeah, so I'd actually like to follow up with that person. If they would reach out to me, I would welcome that.
Yeah, if that person could reach out to Lynda, that would be great. I won't name them. Oh, yeah,
Peter,
and they already said yes. I would love to. They'll send you an email.
Excellent.
we have another question.
A lot of thank yous, a lot of nice comments, which I can pass on to you after the presentation. So it looks like that is all we have in terms of questions for today. Thank you everyone for joining us today. A reminder, as we have on Lynda's slide here, if you would like additional information about the speaker series or to understand what presentations are coming up, if you would like more information about the Institute for Work and Health and our research, you can subscribe to our e-alerts. I also would like to tell you that our next Open Speaker Series presentation will be on February the 2nd, where Cam Mustard will be presenting on the Ontario Life After Workplace Injury Study, which is a long-term follow-up on the health and labour market outcomes of workers' compensation claimants in Ontario. So Cam will be describing that study on February 2nd. So we welcome you all. That the registrations and links for that will be up on our website very soon. There is one question, Lynda, that's just popped into the chat. We do have a little bit of time, so I'll just ask it to you.
Sure.
How are joint health and safety committees evaluated? That's the question. I don't think you've done that in this particular study.
Yeah, that's a good question, which we sometimes put our attention to and anticipate doing in the coming year. So I'm happy to chat about that, but that was not part of this particular study. So I think it's better a conversation taken offline.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you everyone again for participating in the plenary for today. We hope to see you all again on February 2nd for our next speaker series presentation. Thanks again. See you later. Thank you, Lynda. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.